Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. Today's slightly different and a very special video because we have a guest on the channel, and it's not just any guest, it is Let's Talk FPL Andy. If for some reason you don't know who Andy is and you haven't watched his YouTube videos yet, I will link him in the title and I'll also link him in the description as well, but do go check out his videos. But for the first time on the channel, welcome Andy.
Thanks very much for having me on. Been a long time. Finally got it together, and yeah, ready to rock and talk about what we're like a week out now from the deadline. So yeah, looking forward to discussing it.
Yep, this is the business end of pre-season. So without further ado, let's take a look at Andy's latest draft. So guys, little caveat here. We are recording this shortly after the Nkunku news that he is currently injured, but we don't know how long for. And we've also recently had the news that Gabriel Jesus is probably out for a few weeks, was the latest quote, and probably means he won't be available for game week 1. So we're currently going on the basis that we have no Jesus for game week 1, and we may well have no Nkunku, but we don't yet quite know that. So what Andy has done is he's built a draft for us, which is a little bit different, and I'm sure a few people might not like due to a few certain things, but he's also built it on the basis that we won't have Jesus and maybe we won't have Nkunku, and we'll talk in and around that. And obviously the caveat that this is before the Community Shield as well, and I'm sure we'll all knee-jerk in reaction to that. So with this latest draft, there are a few things that I want to focus on more so than others, Andy, because some of the stuff like Onana, Gabriel, Estepinian, Saka, Man United players, that's fairly obvious. A lot of people have that in our teams. But there are a few things that I do want to discuss. So the first is that forward situation. So you're still in a 3-5-2, but you've got a 4.5 on the bench and then João Pedro as your second forward. Do you think there's any chance that you go into the season with such a kind of weak forward line outside of Haaland?
I think it's a possibility. I think the Jesus injury has kind of thrown me a little bit because I was pretty set on that. I saw the reaction on Twitter once he was injured that like making out like we were stuck with this guy that was awful. But I loved him because it let me have a 6.5 million midfielder. And obviously the obvious switch is to now go to Watkins, but there's no 6.5 million midfielders from Arsenal. So it's thrown a bit of a spanner in the works. I think João Pedro is potentially great, just like Evan Ferguson's potentially great, but obviously the minutes are a slight concern. But because of the bench, it's not necessarily a huge issue. Like Ruben Dias and Reece James, when they're fit, should pretty much both be nailed. And I guess the allure of João Pedro is Luton at home in game week 1, right? So after that, if I don't need to play him, it's not such a big issue. I just worry about how the kind of funds are spread around for a draft like this. I mean, quickly, easy moves are obviously Ruben Dias down to a 4 million defender or Reece James, and then João Pedro straight up to Nicholas Jackson. That's something that could be done in 2 moves, or just reduce 2 of the defenders down and just get up to Nkunku if he's fit. So yeah, certainly not a guarantee, but I think with Undav going out on loan, I'm slightly more interested, but not necessarily locked or anything like that.
Okay, awesome. I agree, and I actually think that João Pedro is, I mean, he's such an expensive signing for Brighton. I can't see him sitting on the bench. I think he will be favoured to a lot of their other attackers, and I think he's probably one of the more nailed Brighton attackers. But my issue is, and we discussed this on Andy's channel when we did a video before, I don't currently have a Brighton attacker in my draft because for that very reason, I don't know who's nailed. Outside of Matoma, and I think there are other good midfield options, I just don't know who we'd want. You've got Chilwell and James. This is a bit of a cheeky draft. I quite like it. Now, a lot of people don't like either of these because they are injury prone and they can be rotation risks as well. For what it's worth, I think both will be nailed under Pochettino. Do you think there's a small chance that you do go in with both Chilwell and James? And if you're only going to select one, do you have a clear favourite at the moment?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to say this a lot. Before the Jesus news, the setup was basically that defence, the back three, and then a 5.5 on the bench. Now, originally I had John Stones or Ruben Dias, but I suddenly thought to myself, the fixtures are going to swing pretty quickly for Chelsea, so why not just put James in instead? Because if James, Stones, and Ruben Dias all get the same minutes, then I think Reece James is way more attacking, right? So it is a bit of a risk, but I kind of like taking that risk. And also, with the rest of the team, I know we're not going into them in depth, they're all pretty much nailed. Like, unless something major happens, like who am I using transfers on from most of that attack? And I'm not someone to like quickly knee-jerk. So if Bruno Fernandes blanks for the first 2 games, I'm not going to suddenly panic as if like he's never going to score again. So transfer-wise, they could be quite a few on defence rather than kind of other positions. And also, I quite like the fact what you said just a minute ago, that people don't like Chilwell and James. And I think with all the content now and everyone being so knowledgeable about the game, it's very hard to get an edge. And so if people are put off by Chelsea, and I know they've got great fixtures and I know what they're capable of, it kind of makes me want to go for them a little bit more. So I would say that Chilwell is pretty much nailed at this point. I just don't see me going without him unless obviously he gets injured. And Reece James, if I'm going for a 5.5 and I've got Onana in goal, then it's Reece James versus a Man City defender. And at that point, I think it's pretty close between backing the clean sheets or going for the attacking potential. And obviously the fixtures, which could breed clean sheets for Chelsea.
Yeah, I agree. And we should know, annoyingly, Chelsea at the moment don't have a scheduled pre-season game. There's now, at the time of recording, 10 days until the game week 1 fixture for them against Liverpool. And if they don't have another game, then we're going to find it very difficult to get more information around the defence and also around Nkunku too. They may schedule a behind closed doors game we've heard some rumours about, but otherwise it could be pretty tricky. I would just note on Chilwell, I've come around to the idea that Andy has here that I kind of just like starting Chilwell in game week 1. We've seen they've been very vulnerable in pre-season down that side. Trent does look a little bit more comfortable in this new midfield role, but the defence doesn't look any stronger as a result. And we saw that against Bayern Munich, that they just had tons of space exactly where Chilwell likes to operate. So I honestly think it could be a really decent game week for Chilwell, and I've come around to the idea of starting him. In that midfield, you've obviously got Martinelli and Saka. I saw you put out a post about you might be one of the only people considering Odegaard, and I don't think that's an exaggeration because I haven't seen Odegaard in a single draft, despite him being quite highly owned in the game overall. Is there any temptation for you to either go for a triple Arsenal midfield or try and get Odegaard in there instead of Martinelli, or do you just think you'll end up on this triple up at the moment?
I think there is a chance I go for Odegaard. I feel like I'm one of the only people that's slightly concerned about Martinelli's minutes. I do think he's first choice left wing. I don't think there's really any debate around that. But they do have so many... Even with Jesus injured, let's say Nketiah starts up front. They've still got Trossard that can play on the left. Havertz can obviously play up front as well. So it's not a guarantee that Trossard plays that number 9 role. And even if one of them does start in the Community Shield, it doesn't mean they'll start the game against Forest as well. So I'm a little bit worried about how often Martinelli might get subbed early. And I've talked about this quite a lot. I know we go back to last season. We all sold Martinelli to Odegaard. It went really wrong. But I think there were factors such as injuries to Jesus and Nketiah that meant Trossard then played up front rather than on the left. So it's not that I think Martinelli's not a starter. And I know that his underlying numbers per 90, like XG, expected assists, etc., are higher than Saka and Odegaard. But I think unless you're on the pitch for the same amount of time, that doesn't matter quite so much. So I'm a little bit more unsure about Martinelli than other people. But obviously Odegaard's 0.5 million more expensive. And with this draft, it's very easy. Just drop a defender down. But if João Pedro ends up going to a different forward, it becomes a bit more complicated. What I will say is, right now, we're still a week out from the deadline, I think this is the first time during pre-season where there's a chance I only go with 2 Arsenal players. That's how much I love Jesus. And again, not necessarily that I thought he was miles better than the midfielders, but I thought he was almost as good, and it allowed you that midfield spot. So if I come back round to having to have like an Nkunku or a Watkins, then Martinelli could just drop down to a 6.5 million midfielder like Eze or Matoma, and then suddenly I can keep that pretty decent defence, and I'm losing that third Arsenal, which it doesn't sound great because Forest at home, Fulham at home, first 3. But in isolation, comparing them to other players and other setups, I just don't think it's a guarantee. But it's tricky to let go because obviously they're great and the fixtures are great too.
Yeah. All right. Couple more questions around this draft. You've only got one £6.5 million midfielder, and I should note in my current draft I've got the exact same midfield 5. So I really do like that midfield 5, and actually I've got the same back line as well. It's only the forwards that we differ. So you've only got Mbeumo. Is it because you've got João Pedro in this draft that you don't have Matoma as the 6.5? Or would you say all things equal, you don't have any Brighton attackers, any Brentford attackers, and Mbeumo is still your favourite? Because I've been going back and forth on Mbeumo, Matoma, and then Eze has started to creep into my thinking too. Do you have any clarity on sort of which 6.5 you're likely to go with?
Yeah, pretty early on I earmarked Mbeumo as the best option, and that just hasn't changed. Like, he's not... If I thought Matoma was better, I wouldn't worry about João Pedro whatsoever. I just think... I know people are worried about the lack of Tony, obviously, and it is going to be a big thing for Brentford, right? He's their best player, you would say. And so that's a disadvantage. But the advantage is Mbeumo's minutes go up, and he's probably going to be first choice penalty taker as well. And I also just rate Brentford a lot and their manager. I just think they'll find ways to deal with not playing with Tony, like in a different, setup or whatever it might be. I just think he's nailed penalties, no Europe or anything like that. So I kind of earmarked him as the number 1. On Eze, I'm also getting a little bit of cold feet about not having him because there's 2 players really that I'm questioning. It's Martinelli and Eze because I've hardly had them in any drafts since the game launched, and they are the 2 players that I keep seeing people talk about. So potentially I could go for Eze instead of Matoma, but I think either way Mbeumo is my kind of number one. So unless I put another 6.5 in here, I'll be surprised if I don't start with him. And I don't even think Spurs at home is that big of an issue either in game week 1.
No, I agree. So at the moment, Mbeumo's my favourite 6.5. I'd love to know down below in the comments who is your favourite current £6.5 million midfielder, because there are ones we haven't even discussed in this video, but I think there are a plethora of options for me to be Mbeumo or Eze. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think I'll start with Diaby, but I think he's a potential sort of game week 4, game week 5 when Villa's fixtures start to clear up that you could go for. But feel free to go from the start as well. Could be exciting. The final question is just around Ruben Dias on your bench. Of course, this might not be the kind of draft you go for. Is it just something a bit different to chuck Dias in there versus Stones, or do you genuinely think he's a better option? Because we had quite a few questions over on Twitter, which we're not going to discuss in the final section, asking us to cover John Stones and whether we think he's a really good pick. So if you are going for a City defender, who would it be and why?
Yeah, I'm kind of conflicted by this because I listen to a lot of different people, like Luke, for example, who's great at predicting the Man City lineups. If you ask him about the two, he'd probably say they're both pretty nailed. But if either of Dias or Stones is going to get a bit of a break at any point, it's usually likely to be Stones because he has had a few injury concerns in the past. And I think that Pep Guardiola just is kind of aware of that and will manage him where possible. But obviously at the start of the season, you've got no Europe. So you could argue that John Stones is the more attacking. And again, I'm a bit conflicted because when you watch him, you think that's the case. He's going into midfield. You see him pop up in and around the box. But when you look at the stats, it doesn't really back that up. So I just wonder whether Ruben Dias might be ever so slightly more nailed. But I don't want to sit on the fence, but there's hardly anything between the two. Right now, if I had to say I'm definitely going to go for one, I wouldn't be surprised if I switched back to John Stones, to be honest with you. Because I just think that there is that kind of pull of the fact that he plays in midfield, and you would hope he get a bit further forward. But yeah, it's really just the fitness thing. But until Europe starts, it probably doesn't matter anyway.
Yeah, I think I would agree with all of that. And just a note on what you said about rest and rotation, I think John Stones has to do a hell of a lot more running in midfield than he would do in a central defensive position. So I think that only adds to the idea that John Stones could be rotated a bit. So I'm kind of on board with Ruben Dias. And I would just say, again, to add to what Andy said, just because a player's getting into dangerous positions on the edge of the box, that doesn't translate to opportunities to score goals and get assists. So just because his position is further forward doesn't mean he's getting any further chances. Realistically, for both Stones and Ruben Dias, the most chance they've got of an attacking return is probably from a corner, and I think they're both equally impressive in that regard. So that is your team. Obviously, Andy and I are both working with Fantasy Football Hub this season. We plugged in the team to Fantasy Football Hub, and it's currently rated at 94%, which is pretty high. If you actually start Ruben Dias instead of João Pedro, that goes up to about 96, 97%. So it is a very highly rated team. If you do want to get your team rated for free, there will be a link down below in the description. But it's a team that both us and the AI think is pretty impressive. So that is Andy's latest draft. Again, subject to change. If you want to see his final team ahead of Game Week 1, do make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. But let's take a look at some of your questions that you've asked us over on Twitter. So in this section, we've taken 4 questions that you've asked us over on Twitter that you would like Andy and I to discuss, and we're just going to discuss them in a bit of detail. If there are any further questions, drop them down below in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer as many as possible. A lot of them we've already touched upon, but we'll just do in a little bit more detail here. So the first question actually is something that I've not really thought about very much, and the reason I like it is because it's quite macro. It's not specifically looking at a certain player or a certain player to consider. It's looking at the way we approach FPL. And the question is, does a striker's fixture difficulty come into your thinking? This person said some forwards perform better against the top teams than they do against the lower level teams that set up to be very hard to break down. So the idea here, I've maybe paraphrased this question slightly to make it slightly more interesting in that, do we overemphasize how important fixtures are specifically for forwards and specifically for like talismanic forwards like a Watkins or a Wilson? Do these players need easy fixtures, or do we just pick a player that we think has good data, is on pens, gets good minutes, and just trust that they will score throughout the season, and maybe use our transfers on more high upside midfielders? Have you ever thought about this, Andy? Do you think you maybe overemphasize the importance of fixtures, or do you think always fixtures are king and you'll always try and pick the best forward with the best fixtures?
Exactly that. Fixtures are king for me, no matter who you are. Like, even I always see people say this player is fixture proof. I just don't agree. Like, even Haaland is not completely fixture proof. And what I mean by that is you wouldn't expect him to score the same amount of goals versus Arsenal away as you would for Everton at home. It's just as simple as that. He's so good that he could easily go and score 2 or 3 goals, obviously, against Arsenal. I completely get that. But I would consider that being fixture proof, where you expect them to score the same against everyone. And that's just not the case for most players. So I think I would take into account kind of data, penalties, and stuff like that. But I would also take into account the data for the team that they're playing against. And there's obviously some examples we've seen in the past, like certain players against high lines. So if you know the team defense is going to be quite high up, I mean, Son in the past, probably Rashford as well, etc. That can help, but ultimately you still want to back the good fixtures. So yes, it would definitely matter for me.
I thoroughly agree with that. Yeah, I thoroughly agree. I think the only caveat would be, I think sometimes, for example, let's say you own a forward that has really good fixtures in game week 3, 4, 7, and 8, but they don't have the greatest fixtures in 5 and 6. Sometimes I think it's worth holding through trickier fixtures for forwards, just because they can score against anyone. And if the team's going to score, the forward is likely to be involved. So I think maybe we overemphasize removing them for 1 or 2 tricky fixtures. But I agree that if their fixtures are tricky, like there's no chance of me picking Wilson or Isak to start the season. Despite them being excellent FPL options, the fixtures just aren't there. So I feel like maybe we overemphasize a little bit, but I'm not going to pick a forward with poor fixtures. Okay, so question number 2 is around Nketiah. We didn't really discuss him in too much detail in the team section. So there was a few questions directly about Nketiah. So for example, if Nketiah starts in the Community Shield, is he a genuine option for game week 1? And there are also some questions in and around that of what has Jesus' injury done for the likes of Martinelli, Ødegaard, and also Havertz as an option who might now pop up. So, I mean, the obvious easy answer is just wait for the Community Shield, but this is coming out before the Community Shield. So Andy, what is your prediction on what Jesus' injury will do? Who do you think will start, and how do you think it'll impact the key assets for Arsenal?
So if we're making guesses ahead of the Community Shield, my guess is actually that Nketiah is going to start, because I think last year he was the next in line, right? Jesus got injured and then Nketiah played, and it wasn't that he necessarily lost his place to Trossard, although when Trossard came in he did play really well, but Nketiah actually picked up an injury. So there was a couple of games we got put on the bench and he came on for like 10 or 15, but after that he had he was out, right? And it was all because he had an injury for those couple of games where he was on the bench. So I think he is next in line, but obviously they do have so many options and extra options this year with Havertz that, like I said earlier, even if he started the Community Shield, obviously 5.5 million Arsenal attacker, I'm all over that. But I tweeted just a minute ago, within 24 hours, I'm probably thinking, but is he definitely going to start the next game? And it's hard to know, because I don't want those headaches, but then it's a 5.5 million Arsenal attacker and it might be worth it. But this is the way I would maybe see it going. And Nketiah starts against Man City, because I think being on the last line of the defender, he's probably better than Trossard and Havertz, I would say. But then you go up against Forest, who are probably going to defend deeper and not come out. Then you probably want someone that can unlock that defence a bit more. So that probably is someone like a Trossard. And then obviously that just goes for each fixture after that. So that would be my worry. Obviously it looks enticing, but it's not a guarantee. It probably does help the minutes of Martinelli if Trossard's going to get some time playing number 9, because obviously that's less competition for the left. But Smith Rowe, I think, is fit now as well, so he's around 2. And Havertz, I think everyone assumes he's going to play as the 8 alongside Ødegaard. This might give them the opportunity to be a bit more defensive in midfield against City, so play like maybe Partey, Rice and Ødegaard, and have Havertz as the number 9. But again, it just comes down to the next game. Will Havertz then be the number 9 again? Who knows? And it could come down to the performance of Arsenal versus Man City. You know, Nketiah might start and be awful. So I've kind of going into this season thinking, do I want these headaches? They are potentially great, but they can also become problems very quickly. And the one key thing with Nketiah, unless you've got money in the bank, or you're happy to go for Morris at Luton, who blanks in game week 2, or João Pedro, who we've already talked about, there are not really many get-outs. Even if you got up to 6, you're then relying on Wissel or Evan Ferguson. So that is also playing on my mind. But I do think he'll to just shorten it down, I do think he'll probably be the first choice, number 9, without Jesus. And I might take the risk, but there is possibly a lot of headaches.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the key take home for this. Is it's something that the more you play FPL, the more you do, and it's just removing as many headaches as possible. I looked at my team the other day and I somehow had like Darwin, Foden, James, Chilwell, and I was just looking and thinking that is far too many headaches for game week 1, and you want to try and minimize that, because so many things will happen in game week 2, game week 3 that you don't expect, different bandwagons, injuries, rotation. If you've already got issues in your team and further issues arise, you're forced into tons of hits or an early wild card. So I would agree that you want to try and minimize those. I would work. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, I just want to add something else. I'm going to play devil's advocate with myself here. We kind of mentioned that you've got the same backline and the same midfield, right? And as I've already said, they're all pretty solid options where you're unlikely to need any transfers. And if you remember last year, there were many weeks at the start of the season, not every week, but many weeks where people were like, oh, will I burn a transfer? Will I do this sideways move? We might get stuck in a similar position this year where actually we've got the spare transfers for those headaches. So although it could be an issue, if you're not, like I know some people are pre-booking like Estepinian to Chilwell or something like that. If you're not doing that and you're setting up with the Chelsea players in advance, you're happy to keep your Man United, Arsenal players, there is possibly some manoeuvrability for players like Nketiah, but I'm still not convinced I would start them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was just going to say, final thing on this as well is Martinelli really struggled with Nketiah last season. He was much better with Gabriel Jesus. We made that point quite a few times throughout the season. If Jesus is out slightly longer than we're thinking, and he might be out till, I don't know, game week 4 or 5, then that might negatively impact Martinelli if Nketiah is the one to start. And maybe going for someone like Ødegaard, who seemed pretty much unfazed by whether it was Nketiah or Jesus, might be the slightly safer bet. Or as Andy said in the team part of the video, maybe you just pick Saka and Gabriel and just wait for that third Arsenal spot. But it feels like you're almost missing out on a third asset from what is probably the best team in FPL for assets. So it's a tricky one, but yeah, I think we're both predicting Nketiah to probably be the one in the absence of Jesus. So question 3, after we've just discussed forwards in tons of details, is with Jesus likely to be out for game week 1, with Nkunku a doubt, even if he is back, obviously new to the league, and with Liverpool and Brighton both rotating heavily, which means the likes of Darwin, Gakpo, Ferguson and João Pedro being issues. We've discussed this already throughout pre-season, Andy, but is a 4-5-1 viable? Like, genuinely, is it a viable way to start the season? And if it is a viable way to start the season, should it be a 4-5-1 with Salah in it? Or should it just be a 4-5-1 with the same balanced team, but maybe you just put a bit more money in your bench, your defence, and your midfield? Kind of similar to the way that you did with the draft that you've shown, because realistically, that almost is a 4-5-1. You've just got João Pedro in there too. So do you think it's viable? And if so, would you try and get a João Pedro as your second forward? Or can you just go for kind of 2 4.5s and try and squeeze Salah in?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, obviously, it lines up on paper in game week 1 as a 3-5-2, but it can easily be 4-5-1, 5-4-1. I think if I don't like the 4-5-1, to be honest with you, that much. Not with 2 4.5 million defenders, because you take your bench out straight away. You've only got one option there. And again, I guess if you've got so many nailed on players like most of us will, it's not that big of an issue, but you can easily be forced into moves because you don't have a bench. Like, I think that's one thing that people don't think about, that having a good bench, okay, sometimes it's really annoying. Like, you know, in game week 1, if I bench Reece James and he happens to get a 15-pointer against Liverpool, it's going to be super annoying. But it also means that if one of my players gets injured, I've got Reece James there. I'm not forced into a transfer that I might not want to make. So that's why I really don't like 4-5-1. And also, if Haaland was to miss out a game, you're down to 10 men. Now, he's probably going to get you so many points in the other weeks, it probably doesn't matter that much. But it is just another thing to think about. There's a reason most people don't play 4-5-1. If I was going to do it, I would probably want someone like Adebayo at 5 million as the minimum price, with a 4.5 potentially. So yeah, I don't think so. And also the Salah thing is interesting, because when Jesus got injured, people were like, well, does this enable Salah? I'm like, I don't know how it enables him. He's 4.5 million more. I guess if you're happy to go for a João Pedro up front and then cheapen one of the midfielders as well, or even 2 of them, then possibly. I think unless you're going to captain Salah in game week 2, I would ignore him. If you don't have the bottle to do that, then I'm not really sure why he's being owned in the first place. So, yeah, I think 4-5-1 could work, but I don't think it's a formation that I will rely on unless I've got a setup like the one I showed earlier, where there's a bit of depth on the bench rather than 2 4.5 million forwards.
Yeah, I thoroughly agree that the value in 2 premiums is captaincy, and if you're not going to captain Salah, he's probably not worth it on top of some of the other midfielders. I think I gave it a go. Essentially, I just removed that forward from my team, and I basically upgraded Rashford to Salah, which meant I'd like Bruno, Salah, Saka, Martinelli, and then Burmo. I did like the look of it, but I thought I'm losing Marcus Rashford, who could quite easily match Salah over a short period, and I'm also losing flexibility with my formation and losing a forward spot. So for me, I still think I'll probably go without Salah, but I don't mind. And I think if you are going for a 4-5-1, it definitely opens up that opportunity. So the fourth and final question, you already mentioned Eze, Andy, so this can be your player, but who is one player that you'll almost definitely not own, i.e. they've really not been in any of your drafts and you can't see them coming in, but you would desperately like to have in your team, and you've got that bit of FOMO around them that you think they could absolutely smash it, and you're going to be left with an egg on your face because you haven't got them?
Well, I mean, the big one is Salah, who we just mentioned. Like, I've made so many drafts at this point, I just don't see him coming in. The thing that really worries me about that is not necessarily owning him, because I know he can go and score a hat-trick against Bournemouth. Right? I'm not stupid. I'm more worried about the fact I'm not really leaving a path to get him. And if I want him, it's going to be 3 or 4 transfers or a wild card, and that worries me a little bit. So Salah, I guess that's an obvious pick. Eze, you kind of already mentioned. I'd say the other one, like a player that we know can do much better than they did last season, that I just don't think I'm going to own, but has pretty good fixtures, is Son. But I guess I'm not afraid because not really many people own him. But in terms of a player that could do really well, he's kind of one that springs to mind. Like I'm looking at my team there, and I'm not sure there's a huge amount of other players that I'm particularly worried about. I guess, I know you only said one. I'm rambling now, but I guess whichever Arsenal attacker I don't own as well. Like if I've got Martinelli, I'll be worried about Odegaard. If I go for Odegaard, I'm going to be worried about Martinelli, etc. But yeah, they're probably the ones. Arsenal, Eze, Salah, and Son is kind of like a fun pick, but I'm not that worried because no one really owns him anyway. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah. What about Foden? A player that you kind of mentioned on your videos that you don't necessarily think that you understand exactly why everyone's that interested in, but you know he has a high ceiling. Is there any chance of making his way into your team? And if not, are you worried about him, or are you comfortable enough that the minutes won't be high enough for him to get the points?
So I do understand why people are going for him because, like you said, he is like an upside pick. There's just a bunch of players that if they have the minutes, they're great. And Foden's one of those. Every Liverpool attacker that's not called Salah is the same. And look, if he starts the first 5 to 6 fixtures, then he's going to be great. Whether or not he's massively better than lots of the 6.5s or Martinelli, Saka, Odegaard, Fernandes for 0.5 to a million more, I'm not so sure. I think people look at it that because Man City scores so many goals and because they got such good fixtures, you've got to have players from their team, and obviously that's what you want, right? That you want teams that are going to score lots of goals and have great fixtures, as we've already discussed, but unless you can be sure that player is going to get minutes, they're no use to you. So I don't go out of my way to get 3 City players. You said earlier that Arsenal were probably one of the most important teams for FPL, and I completely agree, because for most of their players, we can be assured of their minutes, and they're not quite as good as Man City, but attacking-wise and defensively, they're pretty decent. So, yeah, I think Foden's great. If you told me right now he's going to start the first 6 games, I suspect he would end up in my draft. But if I got any doubts about that, then I'll just play it a bit safer. Like I know it sounds boring, but I think when you go differential, you should be pretty assured they're going to play. And I think everyone just assumes that De Bruyne is out, but De Bruyne was on the bench in the last friendly. He's probably not going to start the Community Shield, but if he gets minutes, then even if he doesn't start game week 1, game week 2, 3, 4, the minutes start going up. Yeah. Bernardo Silva's still there. Alvarez can play in as an 8 as well. Pep Guardiola's a genius. Maybe he gets Kovacic playing in that position. That's what worries me. I think Foden will start for what it's worth, and we'll see in the Community Shield. But if he does, if he scores a hat-trick, I'll change my mind for sure. But even if he does, I'm not convinced I will definitely start with him.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I agree with all of that. Foden's not in my latest draft, but I won't pick him as my player because I think there is a chance that he makes his way back in. I think it's the £6.5 million mids I'm really struggling with, which is why I kind of asked you about it earlier in the video. But I have got a bit of FOMO around Matoma and Eze. I just feel like it's difficult to pick out the 3 of them, which you'll get. And at the moment, having no Brighton cover for the opening 3 and Luton at home in game week 1, you don't want to start the season with a massive poor. I was going to say red arrow, but I guess it would be. You don't want to start the season poorly. And I feel like you could really, if Brighton put 4 or 5 goals past Luton and most of the main attackers start like Matoma, João Pedro, Ferguson, you could be in for a massive red arrow. And then other than that, I just don't know why all of a sudden I dropped Maddison out of my drafts. I'm now starting to think, should I bring him back in? Because in my first few drafts, I had Maddison in all of them. And I really like the look of him, especially with the fixture swing in game week 3. But I haven't had him in my last 20, 25 drafts. I don't know why he dropped out all of a sudden. So I've maybe got that little bit of FOMO now that I'm overthinking it and over-tinkering, and that I should go back to how I started pre-season. But that's the sort of psychology that we get into towards the business end of pre-season before game week 1.
Yeah, I quite like Maddison. He's obviously the same price as Foden. So then you've got that. Then that is the exact dilemma, right? Is Foden better than Maddison with same minutes? Probably. But if you can't guarantee them, then you probably just go with the safer pick that's got pretty good fixtures. And like with the 6.5s, I know people say, you shouldn't just follow the crowd for the sake of it. But I think if there's a lot of people doing something that you're not, you should probably question why that is. And that's why like Martinelli and Eze in particular, I'm so unsure about, because I've not had them in many drafts, but everyone else seems to really rate them. And I guess we got this, the World Cup minutes thing as well. And I don't think that massively changes how we pick players. But Eze versus Matoma, for example, I think someone said that Eze hasn't been subbed yet under Roy Hodgson, whereas Matoma, with all these players that Brighton have got, I'm pretty sure, like you said earlier, Matoma's absolutely first choice left wing. but he got so many players that he could get subbed off early. So, yeah, I agree with the 6.5s. And I mean, Maddison's not such a worry for me, but I can see why you like him. And I think he stacks up great against Foden.
Yeah, I agree. So, guys, there is Andy's latest draft. We've answered some of your questions as well. If there is anything that we've not covered that you want us to cover before the Community Shield, drop it down below. I will reply to as many of those comments as possible. And also, like I said, please do check out Andy's channel. It'll be linked in the title, linked in the description as well. Do make sure to check him out. It does daily videos throughout the season, the OG Go of FPL YouTube. So do check out all of his videos if you've not yet seen them. And like I said, also make sure to check out Fantasy Football Hub as well. You can get a free team rating. You don't even have to sign up, completely free, using the link in the description. And thank you very much for coming on, Andy. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, until next time, thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.